Daniel Mitchell sat in the glass-walled conference room of Allfield Investments, sweating under his crisp suit. The Texas sun was setting outside the Houston high-rise, casting long shadows across the table, littered with quarterly reports. Just a month ago, Daniel had been a star investment manager here, known for his bold strategies and strong returns. But today, he was the man who had lost $50 million of client money in a single bad gamble. His risky investment in Petrocom, an energy startup, had backfired spectacularly when the company's flagship project failed environmental safety tests. In a matter of weeks, the stock plummeted to pennies. The losses were staggering and very public. The board of directors had convened an emergency meeting to find someone to blame, and all fingers pointed to Daniel. He had championed the Petrocom deal, persuading colleagues and clients to trust his instincts. Now those same colleagues eyed him with thinly veiled scorn or pity. As the CFO clicked through slides detailing the damage, Daniel felt each word like a blow. Due to a serious lapse in judgment, the CFO droned, the firm's reputation and client trust have been compromised. Mr. Mitchell's aggressive strategy breached our risk protocols. We have no choice but to take decisive action. The CEO, Marjorie Klein, a stern woman with silver hair, nodded in grave agreement. Daniel's throat went dry. He interlaced his fingers tightly to stop them from trembling. He knew what was coming, but it still felt surreal when Klein finally spoke. Effective immediately, Daniel, you are relieved of all decision-making authority. You'll transition to an advisory role pending further review. Advisory role, a polite term for a demotion to irrelevance. The words hung in the air. A younger portfolio manager across the table stole a glance at Ethan Chandler, Daniel's close friend and colleague. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod at the CEO's decision. Daniel caught that subtle exchange, and a pang of betrayal flickered in his chest, though he quickly dismissed it. Ethan's my friend. He wouldn't have wanted this, Daniel thought. Still, in the tense silence, Daniel felt utterly alone. I understand, Daniel managed to reply evenly. Inside, he was anything but calm. The shame of professional failure gnawed at him. He had prided himself on being a fearless investor, but now fearless looked a lot like reckless. Clients were furious, colleagues whispered behind his back, and the board needed a scapegoat. Daniel fit the bill perfectly. After the meeting, as others filed out, Ethan lingered. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Dan, I'm so sorry, Ethan said softly. He was the same age as Daniel, mid-40s, but with a confident air that made him seem younger. They needed to do something. It's not fair, but hang in there. We'll get a drink later and talk, okay? His tone was sympathetic, but Daniel noticed Ethan's eyes were strangely distant. Daniel mustered a weak smile. Sure, thanks, Ethan. He appreciated the gesture, but he was too numb to talk. When Ethan left, Daniel remained seated, staring at the empty room. The lights of downtown Houston twinkled below as night fell. He couldn't avoid the truth. His career was in freefall. Leaving the office late that night, cardboard box of personal items in hand, Daniel replayed every decision that led here. Perhaps he should have hedged the Petrocom bet or listened to that junior analyst's warning about the safety tests. Hindsight was cruelly clear, but it was too late. His authority was stripped. He'd be lucky to keep any job at Allfield after the dust settled. On the drive home to his suburban neighborhood, Daniel practiced the speech he'd give his wife, Julia. I've been demoted. It was a bad quarter. We'll recover. He'd reassure her that they would still be fine financially. After all, he hadn't been fired outright, and they had savings. But deep down, he dreaded her reaction. Julia had grown accustomed to the prestige that came with his position. The luxury SUV, the country club membership, the vacations. She wouldn't be happy to hear this news. Pulling into the driveway of their spacious two-story home, Daniel noted the darkness of the house. Julia's car was there, but no lights were on inside. It was almost 9 p.m. He entered quietly, expecting to find her perhaps asleep or out in the backyard. Instead, he found nothing but silence. A half-empty wine glass sat on the kitchen island next to an open bottle. Odd, Julia wasn't one to drink alone. "Julia!" he called out, loosening his tie. No response. He felt a prickle of worry. Perhaps she went out with her friends and forgot to turn off the porch light? But her car keys hung on the rack. As he moved through the house turning on lights, he found her phone on the living room sofa, buzzing with a notification. That, too, was unlike Julia. She was usually glued to her phone. Daniel's heart kicked up. Something was off. He checked the garage. Her car indeed was inside. Maybe she went for a walk? He stepped out the back door and called again. The still night offered no answers. 15 minutes later, Julia finally came home. Daniel heard the front door open and rushed from the kitchen to meet her in the foyer. She was flushed and her auburn hair was windblown. She looked startled to see him. "Oh, Dan. You're home late," Julia said quickly, avoiding his eyes as she shrugged off her light jacket. "Where were you?" "I was worried," Daniel replied, more sharply than he intended. "Your phone's here. You didn't leave a note." Julia held up a paper bag defensively. "I just went for a walk. And a quick run to the pharmacy down the street. I needed some air." "Why are you so upset?" There was an edge to her voice that took Daniel aback. He sighed, tired and on edge. "I'm not upset. I just had a rough day. I wanted to talk to you, and when I didn't find you, I got concerned." He paused, studying her face. Julia was 42, but still as striking as when they met 20 years ago, although now her eyes looked clouded with something like guilt or worry. Perhaps she could already sense something was wrong with him. "Sorry," she said, softening. "I didn't mean to worry you." She stepped forward and gave him a quick hug. He tried to hold her there a moment longer, breathing in her familiar perfume, needing comfort. But she slipped away and headed to the kitchen. "I opened a bottle of wine," Julia called from the kitchen. "Do you want a glass?" "Yeah, sure." Daniel followed her, bracing himself. They settled at the island. She poured him a glass and refreshed her own. "So, what's the rough day about?" Julia prompted, not meeting his eyes as she swirled the wine in her glass. Daniel swallowed hard. "The board decided to remove me from portfolio management. I've been demoted." He forced out the words. "It's about the Petrocom losses. They're holding me responsible." Julia's head snapped up. "Demoted? What does that mean for your job?" "I'm still employed, but in a smaller role. No decision power. It's basically a dead-end position." He tried to keep his tone even, factual. "We won't lose everything. I'll still have a salary for now, though likely a lot less. We have our savings. It's going to be okay," he added quickly, seeing her eyes widen. Julia was silent for a long moment. She drained her wine and set the glass down hard. "I can't believe this," she said at last, her voice cold. "After all the hours you put in, and all the risk." She shook her head. "I told you investing so heavily in that startup was dangerous, but you insisted you knew best." Anger and defensiveness flared in Daniel. He had hoped for support, or at least sympathy. "Everyone supported that decision until it went south," he replied tightly. "I wasn't the only one who thought it would pay off." Julia gave a bitter laugh. "Well, you were the one in charge, and now look what's happened." She rubbed her temples. "So what does this mean for us? Are we in financial trouble? Do we have to sell the house, or—" "No," he interrupted, bristling at her tone. "We're not going to be bankrupt. We might have to tighten the budget a little, but we'll manage. I just need time to figure out my next steps at work. Maybe I can redeem myself somehow." Daniel reached for her hand on the counter, but she pulled it away. "I hope so," Julia said quietly. There was a tired resignation in her voice that Daniel hadn't heard before. "I really hope so, Daniel." Without another word, she turned and left the kitchen, leaving her husband standing alone with two half-empty wine glasses between them. Daniel's heart sank. This was not the reaction he'd expected from his wife. Disappointment maybe, but not this. Distance. She almost seemed angry with him, as if his failure was a personal affront to her. He wondered if she was worried about the practicalities, like money, or if something else lurked beneath her cool demeanor. That night, Daniel slept fitfully on the couch. Julia had claimed she was exhausted and had gone to bed early, shutting the bedroom door. Daniel didn't press. He felt a chasm opening up between them and didn't know how to bridge it. Lying in the dark living room, he stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of humiliation and uncertainty. His career was damaged, possibly beyond repair. And now the one person he relied on for emotional support was slipping away just when he needed her most. In the silence, Daniel promised himself he would find a way to climb back up. He had to, for his own pride and for Julia. He wouldn't remain at the bottom for long, he vowed. But he had no idea just how far he was about to fall, or that the worst betrayals were yet to come. Chapter 2. Personal Betrayal. The weeks following Daniel's demotion were some of the hardest of his life. Each morning he still drove to Allfield Investments, but now he passed his old corner office and went to a cramped cubicle near the back. The firm kept him on payroll to avoid the optics of a high-profile firing, but he had no real responsibilities. Former subordinates now handled the clients he'd brought in. Meetings he used to lead went on without him. Daniel felt like a ghost haunting his own workplace. At home, things were just as strained. Julia grew more distant with each passing day. She spent a lot of evenings out, claiming to meet friends or attend yoga classes, returning late with barely an explanation. When she was home, she was on her phone constantly, texting with a faint smile or retreating to the other room to take calls. Attempts at conversation with Daniel turned into arguments or awkward silences. One Friday evening, about a month after the Petrocom debacle, Daniel was working late at the office, reviewing dull compliance documents that had been dumped on him. The floor was nearly empty. Most colleagues had left to enjoy their weekend. Daniel's eyes burned from staring at numbers. He decided to take a break and wander to the break room. As he passed the hallway near Ethan's office, he heard voices, Ethan's voice and Julia's name. He stopped in his tracks, heart thumping. Julia's name? Here, at my office. He pressed himself against the wall, listening intently. Ethan's door was slightly ajar. Julia's still unhappy. She says he's barely talking at home, Ethan was saying in a low tone. Daniel couldn't hear the other side clearly, but it sounded like one of their colleagues responding. Ethan continued, Yeah, I know. I feel bad for him, but, well, she deserves to be happy too. Daniel's blood ran cold. Why was Ethan discussing Julia with someone at work in such intimate terms? And why would Julia confide in Ethan about their marriage troubles? He peeked through the crack of the door. Ethan was on the phone, not with a colleague in person as Daniel had thought. Ethan leaned back in his chair, phone to his ear, the glow of his computer screen reflecting off his face. Daniel strained to catch more. No, I'm being careful, Ethan said quietly. The last thing we need is office gossip. But sometimes I just want to tell him the truth. It's eating me up that he doesn't know. Daniel's stomach dropped. Tell me the truth? He held his breath, every muscle tense. On the phone, a tinny voice responded. Daniel couldn't make out the words. Ethan sighed. I will, soon. Maybe this weekend. Julia and I are tired of sneaking around, especially now that... Yeah. Julia and I. Daniel felt like the floor was tilting. It sounded as if Ethan was talking about an affair? There was no other way to parse sneaking around with Julia. Daniel's mind rebelled at the idea. Julia was his wife. Ethan was his best friend at the firm. They wouldn't... Ethan continued, voice hushed. She's at her wit's end. He's moping around and she feels guilty, but also she blames him. I mean, the guy practically destroyed their lifestyle with that screw-up. Not that it excuses what we did, but I get her frustration. A cold, electric fury surged through Daniel. His hands balled into fists. What we did, there was no mistaking it now. Ethan and Julia had betrayed him in the worst possible way. While he'd been drowning in professional ruin, they'd been sneaking around behind his back. Daniel fought the urge to storm in and confront Ethan right there, but some instinct held him still and silent. He wanted to hear everything. If he burst in now, Ethan would clam up or spin lies. Daniel needed the full truth. On the call, Ethan lowered his voice further. Daniel edged closer, heart hammering so loudly he worried Ethan would hear it. Look, she's going to talk to a divorce attorney next week. I think that'll force the issue. Once papers are filed, he'll have to know. I just hate the idea of blindsiding him, but Julia says it's better this way. Clean break. Divorce attorney. Clean break. Daniel's vision blurred at the edges. It took all his willpower not to shove the door open and grab Ethan by the throat. He wanted to roar. How could you? But he kept listening, nails biting into his palms. The person on the phone said something that made Ethan chuckle softly. No, I haven't mentioned anything at work. People suspect something's up with him because of the demotion, but nobody knows about Julia and me. And we plan to keep it that way until after she leaves him. I don't want this affecting my position here. You know how office drama goes. Ethan's voice was so calm, so rational, as if betraying a friend was just another business strategy. Daniel had heard enough. He backed away carefully from the door, mind racing. Julia and Ethan were having an affair. Julia was planning to leave him, and Ethan, his so-called friend, had been complicit all along, even comforting Daniel as a friend while secretly stealing his wife. The sheer cruelty of it made Daniel feel sick. He retreated to his cubicle, grabbed his jacket, and left the office unnoticed. Driving home, his emotions swung wildly. Shock, heartbreak, fury, despair. Memories flooded in. Ethan at their barbecue last summer, laughing with Julia by the grill. Julia dressing up for girls' night, maybe to meet Ethan instead. Ethan encouraging Daniel to take risks at work. Had he been hoping Daniel would fail? Had this been going on even then? At home, Julia wasn't there. She had texted earlier that she was having dinner with a friend. A blatant lie, Daniel now realized, or at least an incomplete truth. That friend was likely Ethan. Alone in the quiet house, Daniel paced the living room like a caged animal. He poured himself a whiskey with a trembling hand. He needed confirmation beyond what he overheard. Maybe some irrational part of him still hoped he misunderstood. He decided to check their computer in the home office. Julia was somewhat careless with technology, often saving passwords in the browser. With shaking fingers, Daniel opened her email on their shared laptop. The password auto-filled. In seconds, he was in. What he found shattered any remaining doubt. Dozens of emails between Julia and Ethan, using a secret email account of Julia's, filled with intimate language. They spoke of stolen moments at a boutique hotel downtown, plans for a future together, and conversations about how to handle Daniel. One recent message from Ethan read, "I hate seeing you unhappy. After he's served the papers, we'll finally be free of this charade. Stay strong, Julia. I love you." Daniel's hand clapped over his mouth as he fought back a cry of anguish. It was all there in black and white. His wife, the woman he'd loved for 2 decades, and his close friend, plotting a life together behind his back. And they were blaming him for it, framing his career failure as the reason for their affair. He scrolled further, eyes burning with tears of rage. In another email, Julia wrote to Ethan, "He's such a pathetic mess now. I can hardly look at him. I know it's cruel, but part of me resents him for how weak he's become. If he hadn't screwed up, maybe I wouldn't have been tempted. Maybe I wouldn't have realized how much better I feel with you." Each word was a stab to Daniel's heart. Julia was not only unfaithful, but she despised him for his weakness. The person he most needed support from had nothing but contempt and betrayal for him. Daniel shut the laptop violently, nearly cracking its screen. His breathing was ragged. He stormed into the bedroom and yanked open drawers. There, in the back of Julia's sock drawer, he found what he half expected: a burner phone, likely used to communicate with Ethan. It was turned off, but Daniel knew if he powered it on, he'd see more of the same. He threw it back in disgust. By the time Julia returned home that night, Daniel had worked himself into a quiet frenzy. He sat in the armchair by the dark fireplace, a single lamp on, illuminating the half-empty whiskey bottle on the side table. It was near midnight when he heard the garage door, and then Julia's footsteps. She entered, looking surprised to see him awake. "Oh, you're up," she said cautiously. "I thought you'd be asleep." Daniel stared at her, noting the slightly messy hair and the faint scent of Ethan's cologne, the same one he knew Ethan wore at the office. His silence must have unnerved her because she fidgeted with her purse. "Dinner with Tanya ran late," Julia said, avoiding his eyes as she headed to the kitchen. "Sorry I didn't call." He followed her, every muscle tense with restraint. "Tanya? Is that the story you're sticking with?" he asked in a low voice. Julia froze by the sink. "What's that supposed to mean?" she replied, trying to sound irritated, but he could hear the tremor in her voice. "It means," Daniel said, stepping closer, "that I know you weren't with Tanya, or at yoga, or any of the other lies you've been telling me for months." Julia turned slowly, eyes wide. "Daniel, have you been drinking?" she deflected, eyeing the whiskey on his breath. "Don't change the subject," he snapped, louder than he intended. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I know, Julia. I know about you and Ethan." Her face went pale. In that instant, all pretense fell away. She didn't ask, "What about Ethan?" or try to feign ignorance. She simply stared at him, caught. The kitchen was dead silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. How did you—" she began, her voice faltering. "It doesn't matter how," Daniel cut in, anger rising now that the secret was in the open. "I heard you were planning to serve me divorce papers. That you and Ethan have been laughing behind my back, waiting for the right moment to cut me out of my own life. My friend," he spat the word, "and my wife. Unbelievable." Julia's eyes flashed with a mix of panic and defiance. She drew herself up. "All right, since you know, there's no point denying it. Yes, Ethan and I are together. I didn't want you to find out this way, Daniel, but what did you expect? You've been a wreck these past weeks. You essentially abandoned me emotionally when your job went under." Daniel recoiled as if slapped. "I abandoned you? I've been trying to hold myself together after my world came crashing down. And you? You were off sleeping with my friend? How could you do this, Julia? How could you be so cruel?" His voice cracked with pain on the last word. Julia flared. "You think this was easy for me? You think I wanted to hurt you?" "I was lonely, Daniel. You were never home even before this disaster. Always at work or obsessing over deals. And when you were around, you were stressed, irritable, impossible to talk to. Ethan was there for me." "Stop!" Daniel shouted, his composure fracturing. "Don't you dare justify this by blaming me for working hard. I was doing it for us, for our life. And the moment I falter, you jump into another man's arms, and not just any man, my colleague, my friend. That's unforgivable." He was shaking with anger now. Julia's face hardened. "You want to talk unforgivable? How about losing almost everything we worked for on some gamble? I warned you, but you didn't listen. And now look, you're demoted, your reputation in tatters. I had to find stability somewhere. Ethan understands me, and he's successful in his own right. I'm not going to apologize for seeking comfort when my husband became a broken man." Each word was like gasoline on the fire. Daniel clenched his fists at his sides, to prevent himself from doing something rash. He could hardly believe the venom in her voice. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. Or perhaps he'd been blind to who she really was. Julia continued, words tumbling out in a cruel rush. I'm filing for divorce, Daniel. I was going to wait, but now might as well do it. We're done. I deserve to be happy, and I can't be with you anymore. Not after everything. She lifted her chin, as if daring him to contradict. Daniel felt something inside him break. Perhaps it was his heart, or perhaps it was any remaining will to beg or reason with her. He spoke quietly, dangerously. When did this start? How long have you been cheating on me? Julia crossed her arms, eyes cold. Does it matter? Months. It started a few months ago, around the time everything at work went south. Maybe if things had been different, but they're not. And now you know. Daniel nodded slowly, a numb clarity settling in. Months, he echoed. So while he was working 60-hour weeks trying to save their finances, she was betraying him. When he lost that battle and needed her most, she chose that moment to double down on betrayal. He looked at Julia, the woman he once adored beyond measure, and saw a stranger. An attractive, familiar stranger with whom he shared a life built on quicksand. I gave you everything, he whispered, voice raw. I would have kept trying, Julia. We could have gotten through this together. Instead, you threw it all away. For him. Julia's eyes glistened for a second as if with tears, but her voice remained ice. People fall out of love, Daniel. And honestly, I think you fell in love with your job and success long before I fell for Ethan. Maybe if you had paid more attention. A bitter laugh escaped Daniel's throat. So it's my fault? You cheat, and it's my fault. Unbelievable. He turned away, running his hands through his hair. His world had truly imploded. Career and now marriage. What was left? Julia spoke to his back, tone businesslike. I'll stay at a friend's tonight. Tanya's, actually. We both need space. I'll have a lawyer get in touch with you soon. We can talk through them. He heard her picking up keys. In a swirl of confusion, he realized she'd planned for this. She had somewhere to go at the ready. She was already halfway out the door of their life. He spun around. Julia? She paused by the doorway, avoiding his gaze. There were tears on her cheeks now, but she didn't let them fall. Why Ethan? Daniel asked painfully. You could have had anyone, or at least someone I didn't know. Why did it have to be him? Julia hesitated, then sighed. Because he was there. Because he cared about my feelings. He's not the cause of our marriage ending, Daniel. He's a symptom. This was broken before Ethan and I ever... Anyway, I'm sorry it turned out this way. Her voice wavered on that apology, the most genuine emotion he'd heard from her tonight. Without waiting for his response, she opened the door and left, closing it softly behind her. The quiet click of the latch felt like a final gunshot, signaling the end of a race, their 20-year marriage, over in an instant of truth. Daniel stood in the empty foyer, the silence roaring in his ears. His body trembled with rage and grief. He wanted to smash something, scream into the void, anything to release the pain coursing through him. But he did none of those things. Instead, Daniel sank to the floor, back against the wall, and put his head in his hands. Hot tears forced their way out, and he let them fall. In the span of a month, he had lost nearly everything that defined his life. His career prestige, and now his wife. The dual betrayals, the company's scapegoating and Julia's infidelity, left him reeling. And as if that weren't enough, the betrayal was intertwined. Ethan, the friend from work he'd trusted, was the one sleeping with Julia and feeding her doubts about him. In that dark moment, Daniel felt a dangerous mix of sorrow and burning anger. There was heartbreak, yes, but overriding it, fueling him, was anger at Julia's cruelty, at Ethan's treachery, at the injustice of being kicked while he was down. It was an anger that coiled tightly in his gut, promising that it wouldn't be easily appeased. Eventually, Daniel forced himself up from the floor. He stumbled back to the living room and collapsed onto the couch. Through the window, the lights of their quiet street twinkled. The world was oblivious to the collapse of the Mitchell household happening inside. As he stared blankly ahead, a single resolve formed in his mind like steel, hardening in a forge. They will not get away with this. Julia and Ethan believed he was weak, a pathetic mess, as Julia had written. They thought he would just roll over and let them ruin him completely. They were wrong. They had only seen him in defeat. They had no idea what he was capable of when pushed to the edge. That night, Daniel barely slept. His mind churned through scenarios of confrontation and revenge, though no clear plan yet. All he knew was that Julia's betrayal had ignited something in him that had long been dormant, a ruthless determination. If his professional reputation was shattered and his personal life wrecked, he had nothing left to lose. And that made him, in a way, more dangerous than he had ever been. Chapter 3: Rock Bottom. Julia's departure marked the beginning of a new, grimmer chapter of Daniel's life. In the days that followed, reality set in. Julia moved out officially and went to stay with Ethan, a fact Daniel confirmed when he saw her car parked in Ethan's apartment complex one morning. The divorce papers arrived shortly after, delivered by a courier while Daniel was still numb from the initial shock. He remembered the morning the papers came. He had just brewed a pot of coffee in the silent house. A knock at the door revealed a young man holding an envelope. "Mr. Mitchell, you've been served," the courier said, looking almost apologetic. Daniel took the envelope with trembling hands. He closed the door and sat at the dining table, staring at Julia's neat signature on the petition for divorce. She had filed on grounds of insupportability, the no-fault term in Texas, but also listed adultery as a fault ground, placing the blame on him for marital breakdown. The gall of it. Julia, the cheating spouse, accusing him of adultery, nearly made him laugh. It was a legal maneuver, he realized. By claiming he cheated or drove her to cheat, perhaps she aimed to tilt the proceedings in her favor. It was utterly false, but it showed how ruthless this was about to get. He skimmed the demands. Julia wanted the house, a hefty portion of their savings, and spousal support. Spousal support? She had a part-time job at a local art gallery, but earned modestly. Daniel had been the main breadwinner. Now she expected him to fund her after she betrayed him. The audacity made Daniel's vision red. Under Texas law, adultery can influence how property is divided, typically against the cheating spouse. If proven, an adulterous spouse might even have to forfeit a disproportionate share of assets. Yet here Julia was, twisting the narrative to make him the villain, likely to avoid losing her claim. She and her lawyer were trying to turn the tables. Daniel felt sick to his stomach reading through it. It wasn't enough that Julia had broken his heart. Now she was coming for his home, his money, and even his reputation in court. The petition implied he had been an unfaithful, neglectful husband. Complete lies meant to justify her actions and sway a judge. It was character assassination on top of everything. He hired a divorce attorney immediately, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Klein, recommended by a friend. In their first meeting at her office, Rebecca was frank. "This is going to be a battle," she said, scanning the papers. "They're playing hardball, clearly. We'll need to collect evidence to refute their claims. Do you have proof of her adultery?" That would turn this around swiftly. Daniel had those emails he found and other circumstantial proof. It felt invasive to share, but he forwarded some of the worst to Rebecca. Reading them, Rebecca pursed her lips. "This is sufficient to establish her affair. Texas allows fault divorce for adultery. If we prove she cheated, the court can consider that and potentially award you a larger share of community property as a just and right division. Adultery isn't outright illegal here, but it puts her at a disadvantage for property split and possibly eliminates any chance of spousal maintenance for her." That was a small bright spot in an otherwise bleak situation. However, Rebecca warned him. Even so, divorces often settle out of court. She might press false claims to get you to compromise. But given what you've shown me, we have leverage. Leverage. The word echoed in Daniel's mind. He hadn't felt like he had any leverage in life lately. Not at work, not in his marriage. Julia and Ethan seemed to hold all the cards. They had each other. They had sabotaged him professionally and personally. But maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide in this divorce at least. Over the next few weeks, Daniel shuffled between the hollow house and his humiliating job. The house felt less like home without Julia's presence. Despite his anger, he couldn't erase 20 years of habit where she was a constant. Her clothes were gone from the closet. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered in the bedroom, haunting him. Neighbors, having noticed Julia's absence, gave Daniel sympathetic looks or pretended not to notice anything. He was too embarrassed to confide in anyone about the truth. At work, rumors about his personal life had started to circulate. Daniel suspected Julia and Ethan didn't keep their relationship entirely secret. They arrived at work together occasionally, and Houston's social circles are small. Someone likely spotted them out and about. Colleagues who once respected Daniel now either avoided him or worse, patronized him with pity. The gossip stung. Poor guy! Lost his edge at work, and now his wife's left him. Or, I heard she's with someone new already. Maybe that buddy of his? Ethan tried to act normal at work, but he mostly steered clear of Daniel. On one occasion, forced to share an elevator, Ethan cleared his throat and said, Dan, I know you're upset. I never meant for things to happen this way. Daniel stared straight ahead at the elevator doors, every muscle taut. Don't talk to me, Ethan. Not unless it's work-related, he replied without looking at him. Ethan opened his mouth as if to continue, but then closed it and said nothing more. The tension in that small space was suffocating. One evening, after a long strategy session with his attorney, Daniel returned to the office to pick up some documents. Most everyone had left. As he passed Ethan's office, he saw through the glass wall a scene that stopped him. Julia was inside, perched on Ethan's desk, laughing softly at something he said. Ethan stood close, a hand on her waist. They looked every bit the happy couple without a care. A hot bolt of fury shot through Daniel. How dare they carry on so openly here at his workplace, where he had to see? It took all his restraint not to barge in. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows of a nearby cubicle, out of their view, and just watched. It was a cruel voyeurism, but he couldn't tear himself away. Julia looked radiant, he thought bitterly. She wore a dress he'd bought her last year, and her smile was one he hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. Ethan said something and she playfully swatted his arm. Then she leaned in and gave him a quick kiss. Ethan then packed his briefcase. They were likely heading out to dinner together. Daniel felt physically ill. This was rock bottom. It had to be. He quietly left the office before they could notice him, heart pounding and eyes burning with unshed tears of frustration. In the parking garage, sitting in his car in the dark, Daniel gripped the steering wheel and trembled. He had lost so much so fast. Part of him wanted to flee Houston entirely, quit the job, sell the house, leave the painful sights behind. But another part, a stronger part now, whispered, No. Why should I run? They're the ones who should be sorry. They should be the ones losing everything. As the divorce battle ramped up, Julia and Ethan's aggression intensified. Julia's lawyer filed motions demanding Daniel produce extensive financial records. They were likely searching for any hidden assets or wrongdoing to pin on him, perhaps to strengthen their leverage. At one point, a false rumor surfaced at Allfield that Daniel had violated company policy by making side deals, something that could get him fired. Daniel immediately suspected Ethan's hand in this. Perhaps Ethan whispered to management or HR to further ruin Daniel's credibility. It was baseless and didn't stick after an internal review found nothing, but the damage to Daniel's already tattered reputation worsened. Now he was not only seen as a failure, but a possibly unethical one. Even though cleared, The suspicion lingered in colleagues' eyes. Socially, it was just as bad. Friends the couple had shared were awkward or distant. Some likely heard Julia's version of events, possibly a twisted tale of Daniel's negligence or imaginary infidelity. Invitations to dinners or outings dried up. When Daniel did encounter acquaintances, there was an uncomfortable pity in their tone. "We're so sorry to hear about you and Julia. Must be hard, especially with everything at work." He could only grit his teeth and nod, hating that Julia's narrative might be going unchallenged. Through it all, only a few close allies remained. One was Mark, an old friend not connected to work. Mark dropped by one night with beers and takeout, offering a listening ear. Daniel found himself confiding some of the pain. "I just don't get how it went so wrong so quickly, Mark," he said, staring at the amber liquid in his bottle. "I know I wasn't perfect, but this is like my life got stolen from me, by the two people I trusted most." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "There's no justification for what they did. I've known you since college, Dan. You're a good man. Maybe you were busy with work, but that's no excuse for her to do this. And Ethan, hell, that's a vile thing to do to a friend. I never liked that guy much, you know? Something about him seemed opportunistic." Daniel sighed. "I was blind to it. To both of them. She says I ignored her feelings, and maybe I did sometimes. But I never thought she could do something so heartless." His voice broke slightly. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to get through this. I know it's dark now, but it won't be like this forever." Daniel set the beer down, unresolved anger tightening his chest. "I don't want to just get through this," he said quietly. "I can't stomach the idea of them getting away with it. They're practically gloating, Mark. They're trying to take me for everything. It's like they want to erase me and step into my life scot-free. I can't let that stand." Mark looked at him with concern. "What are you saying? I hope you're not thinking of doing something dangerous. I get the anger, believe me, but don't do anything that could land you in trouble." Daniel forced a hollow chuckle. "Don't worry. I'm not going to do anything stupid like physically harm them, if that's what you're thinking. I know better. I just—" He trailed off. What could he say? That he was contemplating revenge? He wasn't even sure what form it would take, only that the idea of seeing them suffer some consequence was becoming an obsession. After Mark left, Daniel found himself unable to sleep. He paced the empty house, mind racing with half-formed ideas. They should pay. But how? Divorce court would expose Julia's adultery and maybe save him some money, but that felt insufficient. It wouldn't give him back his dignity or make them truly pay for the pain inflicted. A legal victory was too clean, too civilized for what they had done. In his study, Daniel opened his laptop. Out of morbid curiosity, he checked the news and financial blogs. He wondered if the industry had forgotten his Petrocom fiasco yet, or if his name still floated around as cautionary tale. Fortunately, it seemed other headlines had taken over. Daniel Mitchell's fall was yesterday's news outside his immediate circle. But on a smaller finance forum, he saw a thread speculating about Allfield investments. One comment caught his eye. "Heard some big client money was moved around at Allfield recently, possibly without proper authorization. Something fishy after that Petrocom mess." It was an unverified rumor, but it sparked a thought. What if he could turn rumor into reality for Ethan? Ethan had taken over some of Daniel's clients after his demotion. Perhaps there was a way to create suspicion around Ethan's handling of funds. If a whisper of wrongdoing could nearly end Daniel's employment, what would full-blown accusations do to Ethan? And it needn't even be true. Daniel realized with a dark thrill that truth mattered less than perception in the world of finance and law. He had been blamed for Petrocom beyond his fair share because the narrative demanded a scapegoat. Similarly, if a narrative formed that Ethan was involved in unethical behavior, evidence or not, the damage would be done. Investigations, reputational loss, even if he wriggled out legally, his career could implode. Sitting there alone at midnight, Daniel began to form a plan in his head. It started nebulously. Frame Ethan for something. The moral implications were heavy. It was wrong, a crime even, to fabricate evidence. But the burning anger in Daniel's veins readily justified it. They had committed real wrongs without remorse. Compared to their betrayal, a little fabrication to set things right seemed almost fair. He poured another drink and started jotting ideas on a notepad. Embezzlement, insider trading. Those were two financial sins that could ruin a career. Embezzlement might involve redirecting client funds or company money. Insider trading would involve using confidential info for stock trades. Ethan was in a position where either could be plausible if one looked closely. Ethan had access to client accounts now. If money appeared to be diverted to some personal account of Ethan's, that's embezzlement. If Ethan or a close associate was shown to have profited from trades around sensitive information, that's insider trading. Perhaps Daniel could contrive both to really ensure suspicion sticks. He scribbled furiously, adrenaline building. He listed resources at his disposal. He still had limited access to internal systems at Allfield. He was sidelined, but not locked out of everything. He had knowledge of compliance routines, reporting formats, and how regulators examine irregularities. He also had knowledge of Ethan's habits and perhaps some personal details, like Ethan's accounts, or at least how Allfield's accounts could be manipulated. Daniel recalled that at times he and Ethan would talk shop, and Ethan had once casually bragged about a personal brokerage account where he dabbled in stocks on the side. If Daniel could get those account details, or create a dummy account under Ethan or Julia's name, that might serve as a destination for illicit funds or trades. A key would be anonymity. Daniel had to do this from the shadows. If any trail led back to him, he'd destroy what little remained of his life. So he couldn't hack directly from his own devices or network. He might need to use throwaway devices, maybe public Wi-Fi or a proxy. And time. He had to consider timing. Julia and Ethan were pressing the divorce now, trying to corner him. If he could spring a trap while the divorce was in process, it could give him leverage and satisfaction at once. Perhaps coordinate such that just before the divorce settlement, Ethan and Julia get entangled in something nasty that weakens their side. As he fleshed out the ideas, a part of Daniel wondered at how readily he was contemplating such Machiavellian schemes. He'd always seen himself as a straight-laced guy. Ambitious, yes, but not deceitful. Yet, betrayal had changed him. He felt a grim clarity, as if a moral filter in his mind had been removed. The old Daniel might have balked at doing something illegal to strike back. The new Daniel almost relished the idea. He paused to take a breath. He needed to be absolutely sure. Was he really going to do this? Ruin two people's lives in return? Julia and Ethan's mocking faces flashed in his mind, as he'd seen them through that office window, treating him like a joke. His jaw tightened. Yes, they had made him hit rock bottom. Now he would drag them down, even if it meant getting his hands dirty. That night, Daniel wrote out a rough outline of a plan. By dawn, he had the skeleton of what would become an elaborate trap to restore his sense of justice and power. Rock bottom was behind him now. He was about to start climbing back up, one calculated step at a time. Chapter 4. Setting the trap. Daniel's first move was reconnaissance. If he was going to frame Ethan and Julia convincingly, he needed to gather information and tools. Over the next week, under the guise of focusing on divorce prep and trying to move on, Daniel set about discreetly learning everything he could that might be useful. First, he exploited his still active access at Allfield Investments. Late one evening, after most staff had gone, Daniel logged into the internal network from his workstation. He navigated to client account ledgers and trade logs. Though his authority was removed, his login still had read permissions on many records. He carefully searched for accounts under Ethan's management. Sure enough, he found several high-net-worth client portfolios now assigned to each handler. Daniel copied transaction histories and account statements onto a flash drive. He was particularly interested in any irregularities or vulnerabilities he might exploit. One account caught his eye, a mid-sized corporate client that had multiple sub-accounts for different projects. It would be complicated enough that a small, unauthorized transfer might go unnoticed at first. If Daniel could create the appearance that Ethan siphoned money from such an account to a personal one, that could be the cornerstone of an embezzlement claim. Next, Daniel subtly observed Ethan's routine. Ethan often worked late on Wednesdays, something Daniel learned by overhearing an assistant mention Ethan's standing late meetings midweek. Julia usually did yoga on Wednesday nights, or at least she used to. Perhaps now she spent that time with Ethan, but either way, Ethan tended to be at the office. This might give Daniel an opportunity to access Ethan's computer or office unattended. He also recalled that Ethan occasionally bragged about an investment tip or two, flirting with the line of insider info. Ethan had once mentioned a college buddy at an energy company hinting at a merger. Nothing came of it, but the memory gave Daniel an idea. He could fabricate evidence that Ethan traded on insider information, implicating Julia as well. Maybe an email or document showing Ethan tipping off Julia to buy stock in a company before a big announcement, resulting in illicit profit for Julia's account. For that, Daniel needed to find or create a plausible scenario. Perhaps he could use a real event, a recent acquisition or earnings surprise in the market, and pretend Ethan had advanced knowledge. Daniel scoured recent financial news for any big moves. He found one. A local Houston-based tech firm, Synergen, had just been rumored to be an acquisition target. Their stock jumped 20% last week on speculation. Suppose he framed it as Ethan knew about the acquisition beforehand and traded. It was a scenario that could interest regulators. He set to work drafting a fake insider tip email. Using an anonymous Proton Mail account he created, Daniel composed a message as if from a Synergen employee to Ethan, dated 2 weeks before the stock jump. Ethan, as discussed, Synergen's quarterly results are going to blow past expectations. And there's talk of an acquisition by Megasoft. Keep it quiet, but if I were you, I'd make a move before the announcement on 10/30. It looked convincing enough, but he needed to plant it somewhere that investigators could find. Ideally, on Ethan's computer or email. Getting physical access to Ethan's logged-in session might be tough. Instead, Daniel considered leaving a printed copy among Ethan's files or mailing it anonymously to Ethan's clients, who might then alert authorities. Alternatively, Daniel could send it directly as a whistleblower tip to regulators, implying that an insider at Allfield saw this email. He decided on multiple approaches for redundancy. To implicate Julia in insider trading, Daniel planned to create records that Julia, or someone with her name, traded Synergen stock heavily before the news. If Julia had a brokerage account, he could forge statements. If not, he could fabricate an account. One trick. He could open a brokerage account online under a similar name, perhaps using her maiden name or an alias, and make some trades for appearance. But opening an account might require personal info he didn't have. Instead, he chose to fake a transaction record. He knew enough about standard brokerage statements. With some PDF editing, he could create a statement showing an account under J. Mitchell, buying a large chunk of Synergen stock a week before the announcement, then selling after for profit. If investigators saw a document like that, they'd certainly ask questions. For the embezzlement angle, Daniel decided on a simpler yet elegant ruse. He created a dummy LLC via an online service. Texas allows relatively easy company registrations. He named it Gem Holdings, a subtle nod to Julia and Ethan Mitchell, as if a partnership. He then opened a bank account for this LLC. The plan: to fabricate a trail showing that Ethan had diverted a sum of money from a client's account into Gem Holdings, which could look like a shell company he and Julia secretly owned. Using the client account data he copied, Daniel identified a transfer that had occurred recently, a legitimate one where funds moved between two sub-accounts. He crafted a fake transfer confirmation that mirrored the format of Allfield's internal transfer memos, but changed the destination account to the Gem Holdings bank account number. He chose a modest but significant amount, $250,000, enough to alarm, but not so high as to be unbelievable if stolen. This part was delicate. If any Allfield employee looked deeply at actual records, they wouldn't find this transfer. But Daniel counted on the initial shock value of the document to prompt an external investigation. Allfield would be under the microscope and might initially assume an internal error or hidden transaction they missed. Sometimes just the allegation triggers authorities to step in, and then chaos would follow. As he compiled these pieces of false evidence, Daniel was methodical. He double and triple checked that names, dates, and figures lined up to form a coherent story. The narrative he wanted to weave was this: Ethan Chandler, in cahoots with Julia Mitchell, engaged in financial fraud, both by misappropriating client funds and by insider trading with Julia as an accomplice. It painted them as a conniving duo, using illicit means for personal gain. He imagined how damning it would look from an outside perspective. A printed email of Ethan discussing inside info, a fake brokerage statement under Julia's name showing timely trades, a transfer record suggesting embezzlement to a shell company possibly tied to them. Multiple red flags across different areas. It would appear as if an insider at Allfield discovered a web of misconduct. To further ensure the trail led to them, Daniel also composed an anonymous letter addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the Texas State Securities Board, as well as one to the Financial Crime Unit of the FBI in Houston. In the letter, typed and printed on plain paper, he posed as a whistleblower. I am an employee at Allfield Investments and have come across evidence of serious securities fraud and embezzlement involving one of our portfolio managers, Ethan Chandler, along with a client named Julia Mitchell, who is also Mr. Chandler's personal associate. The evidence includes email correspondence about insider information regarding Synergen Corp. and unauthorized transfers of client funds to an external entity. I am providing copies of some documents that support these allegations. I fear retaliation and wish to remain anonymous, but felt it my duty to alert the authorities. He refrained from adding too many specifics in the letter, better to let the documents speak, so the investigators would fill in gaps. A broad allegation like that, with documents enclosed, would almost certainly trigger an inquiry. Regulators are accustomed to receiving tips, and even circumstantial evidence can set off a formal investigation if it looks credible. Since direct evidence of insider trading is rare and cases often rely on circumstantial patterns, Daniel's fabricated pattern might well be enough to start a fire. For good measure, Daniel also planned to send packets of the same materials to a couple of Ethan's major clients. Wealthy clients often react swiftly to any hint of impropriety, pulling funds and raising hell. He knew two in particular: a local manufacturing company's pension fund that Ethan managed, and a family trust of a prominent oil family. He had interacted with those clients before his demotion, and they would be extremely unforgiving if they suspected their money was mishandled. By sending them an anonymous packet, perhaps masquerading as a concerned Allfield employee or even a competitor's tip, he could ensure Ethan's professional relationships caught fire simultaneously. They might confront Allfield's management or yank their accounts, adding pressure on the firm to act against Ethan. The final issue: planting the evidence on Ethan's end. The letters and documents would go out externally, but what if Ethan somehow anticipated and destroyed evidence? Daniel wanted something in Ethan's possession that he wouldn't realize was incriminating until it was too late. One night, Daniel executed a risky sub-plan. He stayed late at the office again, waiting until nearly everyone was gone. Wearing latex gloves, he entered Ethan's office. His old team keycard still granted access to the secured floor and offices. Inside, the office smelled of Ethan's cologne and the faint odor of expensive whiskey. Ethan kept a decanter on a side table. Daniel's heart pounded. If security or cleaning staff saw him, he could make an excuse about leaving something for Ethan, but it was risky. Quickly, he slid a single printed page into Ethan's desk drawer, beneath some files. It was a printout of the fake insider tip email about Synergen. He also took a USB drive and plugged it into Ethan's computer, which was on, but locked. Daniel had prepared the USB with a stealthy program that could run automatically, thanks to a tech-savvy contact Mark referred him to. The program wouldn't hack Ethan's password, but once Ethan logged in with the USB still inserted, it was tiny and black, likely unnoticed if not looking, it would install a keylogger and also plant a couple of the fake documents in his email drafts folder. To ensure Ethan kept the USB in, Daniel labeled it innocuously as Team Photos Q3 with a small sticker and left it on the floor just under the edge of Ethan's desk, as if it had fallen and been forgotten. It looked like an ordinary 8 GB drive. With luck, Ethan would see it and plug it in out of curiosity, at which point it would silently execute its payload, then maybe show some harmless team outing photos Daniel actually put on it to avoid suspicion. Was this over-engineering the plan? Perhaps. But Daniel was being meticulous. The keylogger might give him access to Ethan's account credentials if needed later, and having the email file sitting in Ethan's mailbox, even unsent, could later be used to claim it was genuine. He checked everything carefully, wiped down anything he touched to avoid leaving fingerprints, and slipped out of the office. Back home, Daniel assembled his packets for mailing. He used generic manila envelopes, no return address, typed address labels to avoid handwriting. Inside each, he placed copies of the faux insider tip email, printed. The fabricated brokerage statement under Julia's name showing Synergan Trades. The fake transfer memo showing $250K to Gem Holdings. A brief cover note, slightly varying per recipient. For authorities, the whistleblower letter. For clients, a note like, "I thought you should be aware of potential misconduct affecting your account." He mailed the regulators packets from a post box in a neighboring city suburb to avoid any cameras near his home or office. For the clients, he actually paid a kid from a task runner service in cash to drop them at a FedEx store to overnight to the recipients, adding another layer separating him. With everything set in motion, Daniel felt a grim satisfaction mixed with anxiety. The trap was laid. Now he had to wait for the prey to stumble in. In the meantime, he continued to play his part externally as the wronged passive party in the divorce. He saw Julia only once, at a preliminary mediation meeting required by the court. She was with her lawyer, he with Rebecca. Julia looked tired but determined, possibly unsettled by having to face Daniel. They exchanged only curt greetings. The meeting yielded little. Julia's side demanded more than Daniel would ever concede, and his side countered by emphasizing her adultery. Voices raised, lawyers argued. At one point, Julia snapped, "I'll see you ruined, Daniel, if you try to paint me as the villain here." Her outburst earned a reprimand from the mediator. Daniel just sat quietly, thinking, "You've already ruined me. It's my turn now." A few days after he sent the packets, the effects of Daniel's trap began to surface. It started with gossip at work. On a Tuesday, he noticed two colleagues from compliance whispering by the water cooler, casting glances toward Ethan's office. That afternoon, he overheard the head of compliance request a meeting with Ethan and the branch manager, sounding serious. Daniel's heart pounded with anticipation. Perhaps one of the clients received the packet and rang alarm bells. The atmosphere around Ethan had shifted. In a meeting later, Ethan seemed distracted, fumbling through a presentation. His usual confident smirk was replaced by a clenched jaw and darting eyes. Daniel enjoyed every second of Ethan's visible discomfort, careful to keep his own expression neutral. That evening, as Daniel left, he saw Ethan still in the manager's office, gesturing animatedly while the manager wore a concerned frown. Yes, Daniel thought, sliding by unnoticed, the first tremors have hit. It was all he could do to not grin. Justice, his version of justice, was coming, and he doubted Ethan or Julia had any idea what storms were about to rain down on them. Chapter 5. The Net Tightens. 2 weeks later, the situation around Ethan and Julia was deteriorating rapidly, like a slow-motion car crash that Daniel watched from a safe distance. The trap he had so carefully set was now ensnaring them from multiple angles. It started with whispers, but quickly escalated to formal inquiries. The SEC had sent an official letter to Allfield Investments. Daniel learned of it indirectly. Rebecca, his divorce attorney, called him one morning. "Daniel, did you hear about Allfield? One of my colleagues mentioned the SEC is investigating someone there, possibly Ethan. I thought you'd like to know." He thanked her, feigning surprise, and hung up with a broad smile. This meant the regulators took the bait. The letter likely demanded Allfield preserve certain records and cooperate with an investigation into potential securities fraud. Such a letter would have caused panic in management. At the office, the tension was palpable. Compliance officers were going through emails and trade records. Daniel sat quietly at his cubicle, doing his busy work, while around him small chaos unfolded. Ethan had been absent all morning. Later, Daniel found out why. Client exodus. The manufacturing company pension fund, one of Allfield's biggest clients, had abruptly terminated their contract and pulled all funds under management. Word was they were furious about some malfeasance and lost all trust. That alone was a financial blow to the firm. Ethan returned to the office by midday, looking haggard. As he passed by Daniel's area, Daniel could see Ethan's usually neat hair was disheveled, and he had the look of a man who hadn't slept well. He was immediately called into a meeting with the firm's top brass. By eavesdropping near the door, Daniel caught fragments of raised voices from inside the conference room. "Serious allegations, Ethan. We have to suspend your duties pending this review." "I'm telling you, I have no idea what this is about. It's insane. Client provided documents. SEC. Suspended." The word was music to Daniel's ears. Ethan was being removed from duty, at least temporarily. Even if Ethan was protesting, the firm couldn't risk him handling accounts during an investigation. Trust was shattered. The net Daniel cast was tightening around Ethan's career. Julia, meanwhile, was facing her own fallout. As public or private as she might have tried to keep her affair, the news of an investigation had ways of surfacing in social circles. Houston's tight-knit upper-crust gossips mercilessly about scandals. And here was a juicy one. The wife who left her husband for another man, now entangled in a fraud probe. Daniel first heard of Julia's troubles from a mutual acquaintance, Linda, who called ostensibly to check on him. After the pleasantries, Linda couldn't resist spilling. "Have you spoken to Julia? I heard she's in some kind of trouble because of that new friend of hers, some legal mess. People are saying maybe she was involved in something at his work. I was just shocked, of course." Her tone belied that she was more thrilled than shocked. Daniel played it cool. "I haven't been in touch with Julia. We only talk through lawyers now. I'm afraid I don't know what she's doing." It wasn't hard to sound bitter and distant. Linda sighed dramatically. "Well, I feel so bad for her. She's apparently just beside herself. One day you're in love and the next you're under investigation. Who could see that coming?" There was a hint of reproach aimed at Julia, as if to say she made her bed, now lie in it. After hanging up, Daniel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Julia, beside herself. Good. He imagined her panicking upon learning that the SEC or FBI might want to question her. Perhaps investigators had already reached out since her name appeared on that fake brokerage statement, and maybe in Ethan's communications. Indeed, Julia soon made contact in a way she hadn't since leaving him. One evening, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Likely she knew he wouldn't pick up her call directly. "Daniel, it's Julia. We need to talk. It's urgent." He stared at the message, emotions swirling. Part of him had longed for her to reach out apologetically to recognize what she'd done. But he reminded himself this wasn't reconciliation. This was desperation. And he was in control now. He responded after a pause. "Email me through my lawyer if it's about the divorce. Otherwise, I have nothing to discuss." A minute later, a reply. It's not about the divorce. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Please. The word please coming from Julia was surprising. Curiosity got the better of him. He agreed to meet her the next morning at a neutral public place, a coffee shop they used to frequent, halfway between their old home and downtown. He arrived early, finding a seat with a view of the entrance. When Julia walked in, Daniel almost didn't recognize her at first. She normally carried herself with stylish confidence, but now she wore large sunglasses, her hair in a messy bun, and her posture was stooped, as if the air had been knocked out of her. She spotted him and approached uncertainly. When she slid into the seat across from him and removed her sunglasses, he saw her eyes were red and tired. Good, he thought, not an ounce of pity rising in him. This was the woman who had shown him no mercy when he was at his lowest. Daniel, she began quietly. Thank you for meeting. He nodded curtly. I only have a short time. What is it you need? She seemed taken aback by his cold tone, but forged on. I assume you've heard about what's happening with Ethan. The investigation. I might have, he said, non-committal. He took a sip of his coffee, acting far more composed than he felt. Seeing her like this did affect him, stirring old memories, but he kept his face like stone. Julia lowered her voice. Look, this is serious. The SEC thinks that we might have been involved in some illegal financial moves. They got some anonymous tip with documents pointing at Ethan and me. They think I might have traded on inside information he gave me or helped him with diverting funds. It's crazy. She shook her head, truly looking bewildered. Did you? Daniel asked bluntly, almost amused by the question. He knew she hadn't actually done those things. He had created the illusion. But he wanted to see her reaction. Of course not, Julia hissed, then looked around and lowered her tone again. I don't know where this came from. Ethan swears he's innocent too. He thinks someone at work is out to get him. Maybe someone jealous or a client he angered. But... She paused, licking her lips. They mentioned some account with my name on it. And an email. And I thought maybe you would know something. Daniel fixed her with a hard stare. Why would I know anything about your legal troubles, Julia? She faltered. I don't know. It's just... The timing is so coincidental. Everything going wrong right as the divorce is underway. It crossed my mind that maybe you... She trailed off, clearly hoping he'd interrupt and assure her he wasn't involved. Daniel let the silence hang, then set down his cup. You think I orchestrated an SEC investigation on you and Ethan? He made his voice incredulous, as if the notion was absurd, while meeting her gaze with steady intensity. Julia looked away first. It sounds crazy when you say it. I just can't shake the feeling that this didn't come out of nowhere. You have every reason to hate us. He cut in, voice quiet but firm. Yes, I do hate what you two did. But unlike some people, I don't break the law when I'm unhappy. The double-meaning barb, implying they did break the law, was intentional. Julia's eyes flashed anger briefly. We didn't break any laws. I know what we did to you was awful, but we did not commit financial crimes. You know me, Daniel. I might be a terrible wife, but I'm not a criminal. Her voice cracked slightly on the self-accusation. Daniel felt a small pang hearing her acknowledge being a terrible wife, but he steeled himself. Knowing someone isn't the same as trusting them, clearly. I thought I knew you, Julia, and I was very wrong. As for this mess, if you're innocent, the truth will come out. Why involve me? She reached across the table and touched his hand lightly. The first physical contact in months. He pulled his hand back instinctively. Julia's face fell. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I have no right, but I am sorry for everything. That's not why I asked to meet, though. I'm begging you. If you have any knowledge or influence, could you help us clear this up? You still have friends at Allfield. If someone there is spreading false allegations, maybe you could intervene. The audacity almost made him laugh. She was asking for his help to save her lover's skin after all they'd done to him. Daniel leaned back and regarded her coolly. "You're asking me to help Ethan? To help you and Ethan get out of a scandal?" Her lower lip trembled slightly. "I'm asking you to do what's right. These accusations are false, and you know I don't deserve to be dragged through mud like this. Think of my family. They're hearing I might be some fraudster. It's humiliating. And Ethan, he's on leave. His career might be over if this isn't resolved. This could ruin us, Daniel." She was on the verge of tears. Once, that sight would have moved him to comfort her. Now he felt only a detached sense of triumph. "Ruin you?" he echoed. "Julia, you already ruined me. Or tried to. You took my love and threw it away. You tried to take my money and reputation with lies in those divorce papers. You both left me with nothing and expected me to roll over. So pardon me if I don't feel compelled to lift a finger to save you from consequences coming your way." Julia wiped a tear that escaped beneath her sunglasses. "I know you have every right to be angry, and you don't owe me anything. But I thought maybe you'd be better than letting this kind of false vengeance happen." He caught the word vengeance and smiled thinly. "False or not, sounds like it's the authorities' problem now. I suggest you find a good lawyer, Julia, and maybe spend a moment reflecting on the choices that led you here. We're done." He stood up, leaving a few dollars on the table for his coffee. Julia looked up at him helplessly. "Daniel, please." He shook his head. "Good luck," he said, voice flat, and walked out. As he exited the cafe, he allowed the slightest smirk to curl his lips where she couldn't see. Better than letting this happen? Perhaps he was not better in the way she hoped. But this was his vengeance, and he was not about to undo it. Over the following days, the investigation deepened. The authorities formally launched an investigation into Ethan's alleged financial fraud. The SEC subpoenaed records from Allfield and from Ethan and Julia personally. Ethan's work emails and messages were combed through. The fake evidence Daniel planted was doing its job. Ethan was frantic trying to prove innocence, but the more he struggled, the more damning the situation appeared. For instance, forensic analysts found the fabricated email file in Ethan's drafts folder, courtesy of Daniel's USB implant. Ethan insisted it wasn't real, that he never saw that email before, and maybe it was planted. But it's difficult to prove a negative. Its presence suggested he at least knew of it. Moreover, all evidence was circumstantial but compelling, and insider trading cases often rely on such circumstantial evidence. There were records of Julia's name tied to timely Synergen trades. Even if she denied any such account, investigators might think she was lying or that the account was hidden. Investigators look for patterns like communications coinciding with trades, and Daniel had given them a pattern that fit their narrative of an insider scheme. Julia had to hire a securities lawyer to handle her part. This drained her financially, Daniel later learned through a back channel. She had moved in with Ethan fully, but now their household was in turmoil. The once romantic, illicit affair was replaced by mutual fear and stress. They were each questioned by the SEC and possibly the FBI regarding the documents. Under such pressure, trust can falter. Did Ethan begin to wonder if Julia actually did something behind his back? Did Julia question if Ethan somehow involved her to hide his own wrongdoing? Daniel hoped paranoia would erode their bond. From the outside, Daniel observed some of this fallout. One day at work, he saw Ethan hurriedly cleaning out his office into boxes. He had been formally put on indefinite leave. As he left, a few colleagues stood watching somberly. No one offered help or comfort. Ethan's face was ashen. For a moment, Daniel had a flash of empathy. This scene mirrored what happened to him after Petrocom. But then he remembered. Ethan's downfall was brought by Daniel's deliberate hand, whereas Daniel's own was a cruel twist of fate. He steeled himself in the righteousness of his cause. This is justice, he told himself silently. Ethan brushed past Daniel without a word, but Daniel could see a mixture of fury and pleading in his eyes, as if he suspected Daniel's hand but wasn't sure. Daniel simply gave him a neutral nod. There was no direct proof Daniel was involved. It was their wordless secret. Publicly, news of the investigation leaked. A local financial news site ran a short piece. All Field Investments PM under investigation. Sources say portfolio manager Ethan C. is being probed by the SEC for possible insider trading and misappropriation of client funds. An associate, identified as Julia M., is also under scrutiny. Allfield declined to comment. The article didn't mention Daniel, but for those who knew the players, the drama was obvious. This news brought Julia intense embarrassment. She was not used to being under a negative spotlight. Some of her friends distanced themselves, not openly shunning, but giving space, which in society terms is a condemnation. Invitations to events ceased. The art gallery where she worked part-time asked her to take a leave of absence. The owner cited concern that the gallery's reputation might suffer by association if she were indicted. Julia was crushed by this isolation. Daniel heard through Mark, who heard from a friend in Julia's circle, that Julia was living a hermit life at Ethan's condo, barely stepping out except to meet lawyers. Whatever charmed life she thought she was gaining with Ethan had turned into a daily battle to salvage her own name. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings took an interesting turn. With Julia's situation precarious, her attorney reached out to Rebecca to postpone upcoming hearings. It seemed Julia suddenly had bigger problems than ringing Daniel for assets. In fact, Daniel and Rebecca suspected Julia might want to avoid court for the moment. Any financial forensics during divorce could intersect with the fraud investigation, and she wouldn't want to be on a witness stand right now. Rebecca met Daniel with a grin one afternoon. They're hinting at a settlement on terms much more favorable to you than before. I think her side is desperate to minimize the damage. Perhaps she's been advised to wrap up the divorce quietly, so it's one less front to fight on. Daniel concealed his elation. The net was not only choking Ethan and Julia professionally and socially, it was directly benefiting him in the divorce. He was poised to reclaim his assets that Julia had aimed to seize. The timing was perfect. He did wonder if authorities would eventually realize the evidence was fabricated. But how? He had been careful. Unless some digital forensics traced something back to him, he used anonymous mediums and left no obvious digital fingerprints, it would be extremely hard to prove a negative that Ethan didn't do it. The investigation might drag on without conclusive proof, but the damage was already done in the court of public opinion and within the industry. Ethan was effectively finished in finance. Even if cleared later, suspicion would cling to him. One evening, Daniel was out on his back patio with a glass of wine, something he hadn't done since Julia left. The air was cool and the sky turning orange with sunset. He reflected on how swiftly fortunes had reversed. He felt a grim satisfaction, yes, but also a surprising sense of calm. The anxiety and helplessness that had plagued him at rock bottom were gone, replaced by a feeling of control and closure. He knew this saga wasn't completely over yet. Investigators could still be sniffing around, and he had to remain cautious. But as the net tightened around Ethan and Julia, Daniel felt it loosening around himself. He was no longer the one trapped by circumstances. He had taken charge of his destiny again, albeit through morally gray means. In the distance, thunder rumbled, suggesting a storm was coming. Daniel savored the last of the sunset before heading in, thinking how fitting it was. A storm for them, peace for him. The net he cast was doing its work perfectly, and soon it would be time to reel everything in and return to normal life, leaving his enemies entangled in the mess they thought was someone else's doing. Chapter 6. Perfect Execution. The storm that loomed on the horizon arrived both literally and figuratively. A week later, under gray skies and pouring rain, federal agents executed a search warrant on Ethan's apartment. Daniel only heard about it after the fact, but he imagined the scene. Ethan and Julia jolted awake at dawn by loud knocks, agents sweeping in to seize computers, phones, and financial records. It was the culmination of the mounting evidence and suspicion, the perfect execution of Daniel's plan. The warrant was for evidence of securities fraud and wire fraud, a serious development. It meant the FBI was now treating this as a criminal case, not just an SEC civil inquiry. The inclusion of wire fraud likely pertained to the alleged embezzlement, the $250K transfer. If convicted, Ethan could face jail time. Julia, as a potential co-conspirator or beneficiary, also faced possible criminal charges, or at least the ordeal of a criminal investigation. Daniel learned of the raid from Rebecca, who called with astonishment. The grapevine says Ethan's place was raided by the feds this morning. If that's true, well, your divorce just got simpler. Julia's going to have other worries. He thanked her, trying to sound merely concerned. Inside, he felt a thrill. The authorities had swallowed the story whole. Now, with their devices in hand, forensic analysis would dig through Ethan and Julia's data. Of course, they'd find nothing genuinely incriminating beyond what Daniel planted, but the absence of evidence might be seen as evidence of careful concealment. Investigators might assume Ethan deleted or encrypted things, and Daniel's planted files, like that email and documents, provided enough smoke to convince them there was fire. Ethan's attempts to defend himself were growing frantic. At this point, he had a legal team working, likely urging him to stay quiet publicly. But privately, Daniel surmised, Ethan was desperate to figure out who set him up. With time to think, Ethan might have pieced together that Daniel had motive and enough knowledge to do this. However, suspicion is not proof, and Ethan couldn't exactly accuse Daniel without outing his own betrayal and sounding unhinged. Also, any overture toward Daniel risked violating legal advice to avoid contact with involved parties. Still, an attempt came. One night, Daniel's doorbell rang unexpectedly. Peering through the window, he saw Ethan standing in the rain, alone, looking soaked and miserable. For a brief moment, Daniel considered not answering, but curiosity won. He opened the door but blocked the threshold. Ethan stood with shoulders slumped. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles underneath. "Daniel," he said in a hoarse voice, barely audible over the rain. "Please, hear me out." Daniel kept his face stony. "You shouldn't be here, Ethan. Given everything, speaking to me is a bad idea for you." "Maybe, but I have to ask." Ethan swallowed hard. This nightmare that's happening. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think you might have something to do with it. And if you do, I'm begging you, stop it. Please." Water dripped from Ethan's coat. He looked on the verge of breaking down. The mighty, confident Ethan was gone, replaced by a hollow man. Daniel felt a surge of power, but he played innocent. "You think I caused the SEC to investigate you? How could I possibly do that?" Ethan ran a hand through his wet hair. "I don't know. Maybe you tipped them off or fabricated something. You're brilliant enough. And you had reason. I know I wronged you, Daniel. I know Julia wronged you. If this is your revenge, I'm not even angry anymore. His voice cracked. "I just need you to stop. You've made your point. My career's over. My life's in shambles. She's falling apart. We're probably going to have to leave town, even if we avoid prison. You've won, okay? You've won. So please tell the SEC or whoever that this was a mistake. Don't ruin us completely." It was a remarkable speech, Daniel thought. Honest, raw. For an instant, he felt a twinge of pity, as he had when he saw Ethan pack his office. But he remembered the smug look on Ethan's face when Daniel was demoted, the way Ethan and Julia had enjoyed their spoils. And he recalled his own nights of despair, alone, courtesy of them. "There's nothing for me to stop, Ethan," Daniel said coldly. "Even if I wanted to help you, I wouldn't know how. The wheels are in motion with the authorities. I'm irrelevant to that." Ethan's face twisted, half anger, half desperation. "Bullshit! You could at least tell them you suspect the documents were fake. They might listen to you. You have credibility." Daniel cut him off sharply, stepping forward under the porch light. "Credibility? You think I have any influence with the SEC? And why would I? As far as they're concerned, I'm just the estranged husband of a suspect. If I say anything, it looks like I'm just covering for you or her out of pity or something. It won't help. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing the truth in Daniel's words. He tried a different plea. Then why are you doing this? I know you, Dan. You're not cruel. You didn't deserve what we did to you, but this? Framing me for crimes I didn't commit? It's not you. Daniel's eyes bore into Ethan's. You don't know me as well as you think. And don't talk to me about what I deserve or what's cruel. You and Julia showed me exactly how cruel the world can be. Did you hesitate when you slept with my wife? Did you consider mercy when you two tried to crush me in divorce court? Don't stand there in the rain and lecture me on morality. Ethan flinched. I'm sorry, he whispered. I truly am. It was the worst mistake of my life. I know that now. But this punishment doesn't fit the crime, Daniel. We hurt you personally, but you're destroying our entire lives. Good, Daniel snarled before he could stop himself. I wanted to destroy your lives. You earned it. Ethan stared at him, mouth slightly agape. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the two men in stark relief. That was as close to a confession as Daniel had given. Ethan stepped forward, onto the porch, anger bubbling up. So it was you, he said, voice low. You admit it. Daniel realized he'd slipped. He quickly masked it. I admit nothing, and you should leave. Don't think of recording this or something. You're on my property, and I can ask you to leave. He glanced pointedly to see if Ethan was holding a phone. He wasn't. Ethan shook his head slowly. I can't believe it. The Daniel I knew wouldn't do something so underhanded. That hit a nerve. Daniel shot back. The Ethan I knew wouldn't sleep with my wife. We've both been enlightened, it seems. They locked eyes for a heavy moment. Then Ethan's posture sagged. If you won't relent, then I guess this is it. I hope you enjoy your victory, he said bitterly. And for what it's worth, I really did care about you as a friend once. I never wanted to hurt you like I did. Daniel felt a hollowness behind his anger. Perhaps in some twisted way, Ethan meant that. But it didn't matter now. Go home, Ethan, he replied. Take care of Julia. You two only have each other now. Ethan's shoulders drooped further at that. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the rain, disappearing into the night. Daniel closed the door, heart pounding. That confrontation was intense, and in its wake, he felt a mix of triumph and sadness. Triumph that he maintained the upper hand. Sadness, perhaps, at how utterly everything had been broken. But he reminded himself, they chose this path. Now they face the consequences. The perfect execution of his plan continued through official channels. Ethan's professional licenses were suspended. His name was added to a regulatory watch list, meaning he couldn't easily get another finance job. Julia was named in an SEC civil complaint as a relief defendant, someone who received ill-gotten gains, even if not an active perpetrator. Even if she avoided criminal charges, the SEC could demand she disgorge those imaginary profits from synergon trades, money she never actually had. The irony was delicious to Daniel. She might end up owing money that she never even earned, for trades she never did, all because he made it look like she did. Socially, they were pariahs. The scandal widened with that news piece and a follow-up in the Houston Chronicle that was more explicit. Hedge fund manager and lover implicated in fraud probe. It didn't use names, but the description was obvious. It emphasized the salacious angle of a betrayed husband, an affair, and then a sudden fraud investigation. It stopped short of suggesting the husband's involvement. That would be too speculative to print without evidence. But it painted Julia and Ethan in a terrible light. Cheaters and crooks. Public sympathy, if any, shifted entirely to Daniel as the wronged party. Reading that article, Daniel felt a weight lift. His name wasn't mentioned, but he felt vindicated in a way. The world now saw the two as villains, not him. He had silently rewritten the narrative of his own tragedy to make them the authors of their downfall. As authorities built their case, Ethan and Julia's relationship frayed. Daniel heard through a mutual acquaintance, gossip travels fast, that the two were fighting. Julia apparently suspected that maybe Ethan did do something shady without telling her, dragging her into it. Ethan was frustrated that Julia even considered that, plus he possibly blamed her for being a weak link investigators targeted. The stress and fear chipped away at whatever love or lust had driven them together. One evening, Daniel got a call from an unknown number. It turned out to be Julia's mother. He hadn't spoken to his former mother-in-law in a while. She was a sweet old woman who always liked Daniel. She was in tears, asking if he knew what was happening with Julia, saying Julia was in a terrible mess. Daniel kept his responses measured, saying only that he hoped things would clear up and that he would always care about Julia's well-being. It wasn't a lie. A part of him did care in a distant way, but certainly not enough to intervene. If anything, hearing the mother's distress gave him a slight pang of guilt, collateral damage he hadn't considered. But it was minor compared to what he felt Julia deserved. By the end of the investigation's early phase, the authorities had enough to formally charge Ethan. A federal grand jury indicted him on counts of securities fraud and wire fraud. Julia was not charged, but mentioned in the indictment as associate one. This was both good and bad for Julia. She wouldn't face jail, but the public document labeled her complicit. Her lawyer negotiated some deal where she agreed to testify fully, not that she knew anything, in exchange for not being charged. Essentially, she was cooperating to save herself, leaving Ethan to carry the full brunt. Daniel saw a copy of the indictment online. It laid out the scheme as they believed it. Ethan Chandler, motivated by personal gain and in concert with a personal associate, J.M., did knowingly execute a scheme to defraud clients and to engage in securities fraud. The detail was surreal to read, since it was describing events that never truly happened, except on his computer screen when he fabricated them. It struck him at that moment how one creative act of deceit had begotten an entire reality accepted by so many regulators, prosecutors, journalists, even the culprits themselves in a way. It was a dangerous power. But used to serve justice, he rationalized, it was warranted. With the legal hammer dropped, Ethan's fate was sealed. He likely would fight in court, or perhaps seek a plea deal to avoid a harsh sentence. Either way, his reputation was irreparably destroyed. Julia's reputation, too, was in tatters. The perfect execution of Daniel's plan had left no room for them to escape unscathed. They were entangled in accusations impossible to fully refute, because one cannot easily prove the absence of insider tips once suspicion exists. Now, Daniel had to ensure the resolution of his own affairs, namely, the divorce. He and Rebecca moved swiftly to capitalize on Julia's weakened position. They offered a settlement that previously Julia would have refused. Each keeps their own assets, which meant Daniel kept the bulk, since most were in his name or earned by him, no spousal support either way, and an agreement to non-disparagement, meaning Julia couldn't badmouth Daniel publicly, and vice versa, something she probably wanted now anyway. Essentially, Julia walked away with a very modest portion, mostly her personal effects, her car, and a small cash sum to help her start over. Initially, earlier in the fight, she had demanded half of everything plus alimony. Now she was getting maybe 10 to 15% of the total assets and no support. For Daniel, this was an immense win. He kept the house, the majority of savings and investments, and all his retirement accounts untouched. Within days of Ethan's indictment, Julia quietly signed the settlement. Perhaps she was relieved to just have one battle over. Perhaps she hoped appeasing Daniel would soften him, if she still suspected him in the back of her mind as the architect of her woes. Either way, the divorce decree was finalized by a judge in a quick session, given both parties agreed. The judge, aware of the broader context, perhaps looked at Julia with some scorn. Texas being a state that considers adultery and fault if it had gone to trial, the judge might have indeed penalized her heavily. As it stood, Daniel emerged with what could easily be seen as a disproportionate share of assets, a result that is legal when adultery and misconduct are proven, which in the eyes of those who knew, it certainly was. Walking out of the courthouse after the final divorce hearing, Daniel felt an enormous sense of release. The rain had cleared by then, leaving the city air fresh. Rebecca congratulated him, though she admitted, "This was the damnedest divorce case I've handled. Can't say I expected all these twists, but I'm happy you got what you deserved." What he deserved. The phrase stuck in Daniel's mind. Did he deserve this outcome? He had achieved poetic justice, but by unorthodox means. Nonetheless, he felt no regret. Perhaps a tinge of disquiet at how far he was willing to go, but it was drowned by the relief and satisfaction of seeing it through. As he parted with his attorney, Daniel noticed Julia on the far side of the courthouse steps, alone. Ethan was not there. Likely they avoided public joint appearances. Julia looked small and lost, a simple blouse and skirt, hair loose and unkempt in the breeze. She caught his eye briefly. There was no malice in her expression now, just sorrow and exhaustion. On impulse, Daniel walked over. She stiffened, as if expecting a cutting remark. Instead, he simply said, "Take care of yourself, Julia." She looked down, perhaps hiding tears. "You too, Daniel," she whispered. He hesitated, then added, "I hope you find some peace." It was as much as he could muster in terms of a kind word. He meant it, at least partly. Julia nodded, not trusting her voice to speak, and quickly turned to go. Daniel watched her leave, possibly for the last time in person. He felt a pang of the old love, or perhaps just nostalgia for what they once had, but it was quickly washed away by the memory of her betrayal and the new reality they both inhabited. As he walked to his car, Daniel realized something. He did feel at peace. In executing his revenge to perfection, he had not only restored balance in his world, but he had also shed the weight of bitterness. He had seen Julia and Ethan brought low, and now it was done. He didn't need to hate them anymore. They were effectively out of his life, no threat to him, and justice, as he saw it, had been served. Now, nothing held him back from moving forward. The last chapter of this saga had concluded with an almost cinematic finality. Dark deeds punished, assets secured, the hero free to start anew. All that remained was to actually start that new life. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt confident and unafraid of what lay ahead. Chapter 7. Return to normal life. In the aftermath of the investigation and divorce, Daniel found himself standing amid the pieces of his old life, ready to rebuild. With Julia gone and the house legally his, he made some changes long overdue. He repainted the living room a lighter color, let in more sunshine. He donated the expensive but stuffy furniture Julia had picked out, opting for a simpler, more comfortable style. It was cathartic, reclaiming the space entirely as his own. He also resigned from Allfield Investments. With Ethan's scandal rocking the firm, many expected Daniel might be asked to leave anyway, guilt by association or simply being part of unpleasant history. But Daniel decided on his own terms. He left amicably, with polite goodbyes to those colleagues who remained friendly. The firm was reeling from the loss of clients and trust, and Daniel frankly had no desire to stay in a tainted environment. Instead, he took the bold step of launching his own financial consulting practice. It started small, just him renting a single office downtown. But his years of experience and the notoriety of recent events strangely worked in his favor. In the industry grapevine, some painted Daniel as a whistleblower hero who had aided regulators in catching Ethan. This was a subtle narrative that emerged, perhaps fueled by Daniel's quiet suggestions to a few contacts that I suspected something was off with Ethan, but I didn't have proof until it came out. This gave him an aura of integrity in the eyes of those who wanted to believe it. After all, Daniel had been the wronged party all along, and what sweeter tale than the wronged party secretly helping bring the wrongdoers to justice? It wasn't the truth, but it wasn't entirely false either. He had brought them down, just not in the virtuous way people assumed. Thus, within months, Daniel attracted a couple of significant clients for his new firm. One was the pension fund that had left Allfield. Their manager approached Daniel privately, saying they felt sorry he'd been dragged into the firm's drama and that they respected his ethical stand. It was almost absurd, receiving praise for ethics while benefiting from deception. But Daniel chose to accept it as a second chance to be the professional with integrity he'd always thought himself to be. He hired a small team, 2 younger analysts, and mentored them carefully, ensuring they avoided the kind of risk that had sunk Petrocom. This time, Daniel would run things right, with hard lessons learned. He was cautious but firm, and it paid off as performance for his clients was steady and growing. The consulting firm gradually morphed into a boutique asset management outfit, rebuilding the reputation he once lost. The legal matters around Ethan continued, but faded to background noise for Daniel. Ethan eventually took a plea deal, pleading guilty to 1 count of securities fraud. His lawyers likely convinced him that fighting in court with largely circumstantial evidence against him was too risky. Juries convict on smoke if there's enough to imply a fire. The plea meant a reduced sentence. Daniel heard he got 2 years in federal prison and heavy financial penalties. It also meant no messy trial where Daniel's name might come up unexpectedly. With a plea, all was settled quietly. Julia, for her cooperation, whatever it was worth, was not prosecuted further. But she wasn't off easy. The SEC pursued a civil action to recover the ill-gotten gains from those Synergen trades she never made. In the end, Julia agreed to pay a fine and disgorge about $100,000, money she didn't actually have from profits, so effectively a fine that likely wiped out much of her remaining savings. Daniel was aware of this through public records. He found it both darkly amusing and somewhat sad. Post-divorce, Julia had no claim on Daniel's assets, and with her own funds depleted, she was in a precarious spot. The house she once fought for remained Daniel's. He continued living there, though he considered selling it for a fresh start. Julia moved out of Ethan's condo. With him headed to prison, he sold it to cover legal costs. She ended up renting a small apartment in a different city to avoid the glare of Houston gossip. She also found a job away from finance or art circles, something like an office manager role, according to what Daniel later gleaned through mutual friends. It was a far cry from the comfortable life she had with Daniel, but it was a start for her. Interestingly, one friend relayed that Julia expressed remorse to them. She allegedly said losing everything made her realize the depth of her mistakes, that betraying Daniel was the worst decision of her life. She apparently didn't blame him for not helping her when things went south. If anything, she blamed herself and Ethan for flying too close to the sun, which Daniel thought was an apt metaphor, except they hadn't just flown, they were pushed. By the time spring bloomed in Texas, Daniel's life had reached an equilibrium. He woke up one Saturday morning in his quiet house, brewed coffee, and sat on the porch listening to birds. It felt peaceful. There were no urgent court dates, no dread of seeing an estranged spouse or backstabbing friend, no hostile work environment. Just the calm of a new day. He reflected on the journey. It was a tale he wouldn't tell most people. The true version remained his secret. But its lessons were etched in him. He understood now the value of dignity and resilience. He had been knocked down further than he ever thought possible, and he got back up not by forgiving and forgetting, but by fighting strategically for justice on his own terms. In quiet moments, Daniel acknowledged to himself that his methods were ethically questionable. He had essentially committed the crime of fabricating evidence, framing others. That was a fact. But he took solace in a particular thought. He hadn't framed innocence. While Ethan and Julia weren't guilty of those specific financial crimes, they were guilty of grievous personal wrongs. In a karmic sense, he reasoned, they deserved punishment, and he delivered it where it hurt most, their ambitions and social standing. Moreover, they believed each other capable of such fraud once the seed was planted, which spoke to their own trust and moral failings. If they had unshakable trust or innocence, maybe they could have weathered it. Instead, they crumbled. That, Daniel felt, justified his actions further. On a legal front, Daniel remained cautious. He had left no trail, and with Ethan taking a plea, the case closed without any hint of a mysterious mastermind. To any observer, it was simply a tale of greed and hubris by two lovers caught in their own web. Daniel's involvement was not even a footnote. One day, about a year after it all, Daniel received a letter with a California return address he didn't recognize. Opening it, he found it was from Julia. Inside, a handwritten note. Daniel, I hope you're doing well. I am writing to apologize sincerely for all the hurt I caused you. You didn't deserve any of it. Losing you and everything we had is my deepest regret. I know I can't undo what I did. I just want you to know I have been punishing myself each day for it, trying to become a better person from the wreckage. I understand why you won't speak to me, and I won't bother you again after this. I'm glad you rebuilt your life. You always deserved success and happiness. I'm sorry I ever stood in the way of that. Julia. Daniel read it twice. He felt a weight he hadn't realized was their lift. Her letter didn't mention the investigation or blame him for anything. It was as if she accepted it all as a fate she brought on herself. In that acceptance, Daniel found a measure of closure. He didn't respond, but he filed the letter away rather than trash it. It was a reminder of how far he'd come. Now in his 40s and starting anew, Daniel even opened up to the idea of dating again. Slowly, carefully, he went on a few dates. He was honest about being divorced, though naturally he didn't delve into the messy details. With time, he met someone, a woman named Celeste, who was a financial analyst for a renewable energy firm. She knew of his professional reputation, the sanitized one, and admired his expertise. More importantly, she was kind and grounded, a fresh breeze separate from the turmoil of the past. Daniel took it slowly, not rushing into anything, but it felt promising and, above all, normal. One evening, Daniel and Celeste attended a dinner event for finance professionals. It was at a swanky Houston hotel ballroom. A year ago, Daniel might have shunned such public gatherings, but now he felt comfortable. As they mingled, he noticed a few familiar faces. Some gave him nods of respect, the subtext being, "There's the guy who blew the whistle on that fraud scandal." One even clapped him on the back and said, "Good to see you, Mitchell. This industry needs men with a backbone like yours." Daniel just smiled. He couldn't exactly correct their assumptions without raising eyebrows. So he accepted the praise modestly. He realized that in the end, by sheer outcome, he had become what he wanted to be seen as, a man of honor who overcame adversity. The path to get there would remain his secret. Celeste later remarked, "People really respect you. You're like a celebrity around here. I heard one of them call you the Phoenix, rising from the ashes and all." She laughed gently. "Phoenix, huh?" Daniel mused. "I like that better than Icarus." She tilted her head curiously, not catching the reference. He just smiled and squeezed her hand. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just glad to be where I am, with everything I have now." And he meant it. As the night of the event wound down, Daniel stepped out onto the balcony for some air. The Houston skyline glittered. In the distance, he could see the outline of the offices of Allfield and the other towers where so much drama had unfolded. Those were chapters closed. He thought of Ethan, likely serving time far away, perhaps reflecting on his own actions. He wondered if, when Ethan eventually got out, he'd try to redeem himself or disappear. Either way, Ethan was no threat or concern now. Julia was rebuilding in her own way, far from him. He wished her no harm anymore. He realized he even hoped she'd be all right. At that moment, Daniel felt something unusual. Gratitude. Not for the pain he went through, but for the inner strength it forged. He had discovered a part of himself capable of extraordinary cunning and resolve. That discovery changed him forever. He knew he would never allow himself to be made a victim again, not by misfortune, and certainly not by betrayal. The value of dignity, he had reclaimed it, and it was sweeter than any profit or deal he'd ever made. Resilience. He had proven to himself that he could weather any storm and come out not just intact, but stronger. And strategic justice? Yes. He had meted out justice in a way that was unconventional but effective, and in doing so, found a sort of moral balance he could live with. As Celeste joined him on the balcony, wrapping her arm around his, Daniel smiled genuinely. His life was his own again, and a new beginning was well underway. He whispered a quiet goodbye to the ghost of the past, the betrayed husband, the failed investor, the man consumed by vengeance. Those were roles he played, but now he was simply Daniel Mitchell once more, a bit older, a lot wiser, and finally free. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. The story of Daniel Mitchell ultimately became one of renewal. In the year following the tumult, he fully established his new consulting firm, garnering respect and success on his own terms. The shadow of his downfall was eclipsed by the brightness of his resurgence. He ran his business ethically and cautiously, determined never to let hubris or trust in the wrong people undo him again. Ethan, disgraced and stripped of his career, quietly left Houston before reporting for his prison sentence. The once charismatic portfolio manager became a cautionary tale whispered in industry circles, a reminder that deceit and unethical behavior will catch up with you, one way or another. Whether or not he fully grasped how he had been outmaneuvered by Daniel, he had ample time in a prison cell to reflect on the chain of choices that led him there. Julia, left with no financial support or status, moved back to her hometown in California to live with a relative for a while. Starting over in her 40s was humbling. She found work away from the high-flying social scene, kept to herself, and, according to a mutual friend, even started attending therapy and community college classes, perhaps aiming for a new career path. Her fall from grace was a topic of gossip for a time, but gossip always finds new fodder, and eventually, people moved on. In a sense, this anonymity was her own second chance to live a more honest life out of the harsh spotlight. For Daniel, every day of his new beginning carried a sense of earned contentment. He would wake early, exercise, and head to his own office, where a small team greeted him as their mentor and leader. The stress that once bent his back was gone. Running his own show allowed him to balance life better. He even rekindled old hobbies, something he'd neglected during his marriage and high-pressure career. He joined a weekend hiking group, finding camaraderie in nature trails outside the city. He dusted off his old acoustic guitar and spent some evenings strumming on the porch, a quiet joy he hadn't indulged in years. His relationship with Celeste grew steadily. She admired his resilience, and he appreciated her honesty and warmth. One weekend, they took a road trip to the Texas Hill Country. Sitting by a campfire under the stars, Daniel opened up to her in broad strokes about what he'd been through: the betrayal, the divorce, the scandal at work. He kept the focus on how it felt and what he learned, rather than the gritty details. Celeste listened, sometimes squeezing his hand in empathy, sometimes shaking her head at the injustice he'd faced. At one point, she asked softly, "Do you ever regret not, I don't know, retaliating more openly? Making them publicly apologize or something?" It was as close as she got to suggesting revenge, not knowing he had done far more. Daniel stared into the flames. "I think the universe dealt with them in its own way," he said with a small smile. "I didn't need to do anything more. What was important was that I didn't let it break me. I wanted my life back, and I got it." She nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. In his heart, Daniel acknowledged the sly truth of his words. He had ensured the universe dealt with them, but in the end, what mattered was his life was his again. As part of truly moving on, Daniel eventually sold the house that held so many memories. He bought a new, modern condo with a view of the city skyline, a symbolic break from the suburban family life that died with his marriage. He kept a few mementos from the old house, an album of happy photos, because not all the past was tainted, and one of the paintings Julia had chosen that he always liked. Separated from the context of her, it was just a beautiful piece of art. These reminded him that life has phases, and even in a phase that ends badly, there were genuine good moments worth remembering without pain. On a sunny autumn afternoon in his new condo, Daniel stood on the balcony watching the city bustle below. He was on a call with his attorney Rebecca, not for legal issues of his own, but discussing a potential collaborative effort to host seminars on financial ethics and risk management. It was Rebecca's idea. She was pivoting to some consultancy work and figured Daniel's story, the public version, and expertise could educate others. Daniel agreed. Not only did it feel right to share lessons, but it also further cemented his reputation as a force for good practice. He hung up after finalizing a schedule for a workshop, feeling content. Celeste would be coming over for dinner soon. He had picked up steaks to grill and a bottle of wine to share. The simple pleasures of preparing a meal with someone he cared about felt almost novel after years of turmoil. Before going inside to marinate the steaks, Daniel took a moment to reflect on where he stood. He recalled a quote he once read, "Justice is a dish best served cold." In his case, he had served it methodically, and indeed coldly, with patience and calculation. It had been served, and now it was done. Another saying came to mind, one that resonated more in this peaceful moment. After vengeance, there is healing. He had healed. The scars were there, yes, but scars are a sign of healing, of skin made stronger at a broken place. Daniel's soul had its scars, the betrayal, the moral compromise he undertook, but it was stronger for them. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across his balcony, Daniel made a quiet vow to himself to cherish this second chance and to never lose sight of who he was and what he valued. Dignity, resilience, justice. These were not just dramatic concepts from his ordeal. They would be cornerstones of how he lived going forward. Celeste arrived with a knock and her bright smile. They embraced, and she immediately launched into a funny story about a meeting she had that day. Daniel laughed easily, feeling at home in her presence. They cooked, ate, and later watched a favorite show curled up on the couch. The normalcy and warmth of it all might have seemed mundane to some, but to Daniel it was precious. In the back of his mind, he knew life would have challenges ahead. That's the nature of living. But he felt ready for them. He had navigated darkness and came out the other side into light. The future was uncertain as ever. But Daniel had confidence now that he could handle whatever came, strategically and justly. Before turning in for the night, he stepped out once more to the balcony alone, just for a breath of night air. The city lights twinkled, each perhaps representing a story of someone's own struggles and hopes. He felt connected to humanity in its flawed, striving glory. No longer mired in his personal tragedy, he was part of the larger flow again. Daniel closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. He felt gratitude for the lessons learned, for the justice achieved, for the new beginning he was blessed with. Not every story of betrayal finds a fair ending, he mused, but I fought to make mine one that did. In that fight, he found himself. With that thought bringing a final smile to his face, Daniel Mitchell turned and went inside to the life he had rebuilt, ready to live it with a full heart and a clear conscience, the dark chapter of betrayal and revenge finally, firmly behind him.